This is Larry the Bearded Wonder with World 1-1, and you're tuned to the World 1-1 Podcast Network. Press start to engage your mind.
Hello, this is your host Zoe, and welcome to Mind Over Media Podcast, a podcast powered by the World 1-1 Network. Here's a note for all listeners. I am not a licensed psychologist, and all views from the show are from my point of view or from the point of view of my guests. Please take this into consideration while listening. Thank you. For today's session of Mind Over Media, we'll be discussing how BDSM can be used as a tool to help with mental health, looking at the movie Secretary starring James Spader and Maggie Gyllenhaal. Now, get comfy, relax as we get ready to blow our minds.
Spoilers.
As previously stated, there are spoilers ahead. While we try not to reveal everything about the media we cover, there are spoilers about the content. Keep that in mind as you enjoy today's show. Welcome to today's session of Mind Over Media. I'm your host, Zoe, and before we dive into the specifics of this movie, there needs to be some disclaimers made first. First, kink is not for everyone. This episode is by no means trying to convince anyone to join the BDSM community for the sole purpose of aiding their mental health. This is simply to shed light on how it may be helpful for those already with an interest. Second, this is not an advocate for anyone to emulate the relationship style seen in the movie, as there are some issues given the movie's oversimplified version of BDSM. But, to be fair, this movie was made 20 years ago. The episode simply means to shed light on how BDSM can be a powerful resource in improving mental health. The movie does show some great areas of this, and I will be solely focusing on those areas. Third, not everyone in the BDSM community has a mental illness or a history of trauma. In fact, in research, it was found that those in the community were no more troubled than the average population. So I don't want you to think only people with mental issues engage in this practice. Lastly, I want to provide a content warning, as there will be multiple mentions of self-harm in today's episode. If that is a topic that may trigger you, I do not recommend continuing further. With that out of the way, on to the rest of our session. So as always, here's a quick synopsis of the film. The movie opens up with Lee Holloway, a socially awkward and emotionally sensitive young woman, recently being released from a mental hospital following an incident of self-harm. When she goes home, you learn that she is part of a very dysfunctional family. Her dad is an alcoholic, and that causes many issues for her family and between her parents. She tries to acclimate to normal life by trying to obtain to get a job. She does this by going and learning typing skills. She then uses those skills to earn a job as the secretary for the attorney E. Edward Gray. It is during this job that their professional relationship starts to turn into much more rather quickly. So I'm not going to go into all of the details on how their relationship blooms and flourishes. If you would like to know any of that, watch the movie. But like I said, I solely want to focus on these components of how their BDSM relationship helped Lee's mental health. So, now that we have an idea of the setup, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Remember, this movie is used as a mental health resource, and we're not focusing on the sexual elements of this movie. A core part of Miss Holloway and Mr. Gray's relationship is the BDSM concept of total power exchange. This happens when one person gives up complete control to another person. In the movie, Mr. Gray not only tells Lee what to do at work, but what to eat, how to act, what to wear, etc. This can be beneficial from both sides of the spectrum. Lee often feels her life is out of control and she doesn't know who she is. Having Mr. Gray give her structure eases her anxious mind and simply allows her to focus on what she's being told. She doesn't have to worry because she isn't the one making the decisions. Also, Mr. Gray's life as an attorney can be quite chaotic at times. However, finding control in this area of his life can be quite cathartic. An important thing to notice is that Mr. Gray tells Lee to do things that aren't solely for his benefit, but for hers as well. He helps her to be able to answer the phone better to help improve her confidence. He encourages her to speak louder and more direct. He has her walk home instead of her mom driving her so that she can regain her independence, being that she's an adult even though her parents treat her like a child. He supports her in her being her best self. And this leads me to another key element of their relationship. This element gets most, if not the primary focus in this film. Mr. Gray and Lee engage in a sadomasochistic relationship. Mr. Gray likes giving pain and Lee likes receiving it. This is in large part to Lee's history of self-harm. Now, to reiterate a point I made earlier, not everyone who is a masochist has a history of self-harm or other violence in their life. This just so happens to be the case in this film. In the movie, we learn that Lee has been cutting herself since 7th grade. Given that she is a young woman now, it means she's been doing this for quite a long time. Lee's family is highly dysfunctional due in large part to her father's alcoholism. He can't hold down a job, he can't take care of his family, and that causes Lee's parents to argue a lot. We see an instance where her parents are arguing in the kitchen and Lee goes upstairs and harms herself to relieve the built-up tension. Growing up in a home like this, life can feel unpredictable and chaotic. Lee uses self-harm as a way to ease the overwhelming feelings that she gets from it all. We see in the movie that Lee turns to cutting in any stressful situation, but more often than not, it relates to her family. So, given that her home life is very chaotic, engaging in a relationship that is so controlled, and you just have to follow what you're being told is relieving for her. She no longer has that unpredictability in her life. There is a point in the movie where Lee is about to cut herself at work and Mr. Gray walks in on her. She stops and tries to pretend it didn't happen, but they both clearly know that it did. He mentions it to her later and asks her why she cuts herself. The answer he gives is way more insightful than I expected it to be in a movie like this. He asks Lee if the reason she cuts herself is that sometimes the pain inside has to come to the surface, and when you see the evidence of the pain inside, you finally know you are really here. Then when you watch the wound heal, it's comforting. I related to that very well as someone who struggles with self-harm or struggled with self-harm. That was in large part why I did it. I would hurt myself and then watch it heal, and in my head I was like, hey, I was in this bad spot, but I'm getting better now. And there was a way to see that physically. Now, traditionally, people self-harm for a few reasons. One, to block out emotional pain by forcing your body to focus on the physical pain. The person believes they deserve to be punished, or it is a release of high anxiety and stress. It is in this scene that Mr. Gray tells Lee she is never to cut herself again, and she doesn't. Later, she actually throws her cutting kit off a bridge. He gives her an order that is strictly for her benefit, not for himself. Her not cutting herself anymore is just for her benefit. Furthermore, pain can be a cathartic release for some people, and sadomasochism can be a way to achieve that. Unlike self-harm, the pain is being inflicted by someone other than you, and this way can be more controlled. This lowers the risks of accidental slip-ups like what happened with Lee earlier. This is why she went to the hospital. She was trying to rush in her self-harm, slipped and cut too deep. Mr. Gray administers the pain not only for his own sexual pleasure, but because he knows that she needs it. It was also recorded in a study that those engaging in sadomasochism experience the same chemical release in their brain that a person might get from working out, which I think is interesting considering when Mr. Gray feels his arousal coming on and wants to do these taboo things to Lee, he will often engage in workouts, sit-ups, pull-ups, push-ups to release that energy, because there's a release of endorphins and also a release of the stress-relieving chemical cortisol. So there is a large reason why pain can be a release. Now, I know this seems kind of backwards. Well, it's still self-harm. Someone else is just doing it. But I've even been told by my own therapist, because I am someone who engages in the BDSM lifestyle, that if done in a healthy way, it is okay. But I know that that is a kind of controversial take on this particular issue. But in the film, Lee does mention multiple times that having Mr. Gray to guide her gave her courage and strength that she had never had before. Having that support made all the difference in her life. And at the end of the film, she describes her feelings about Mr. Gray in an interesting way. She says, "In one way or another, I've always suffered. I don't know why exactly, but I do know that I'm not so scared of suffering anymore. I feel more than I've ever felt, and I've found someone to feel with." I found this line to be incredibly moving personally. As someone who has a history of trauma, and that trauma being physical abuse, engaging in sadomasochism allows me to suffer in a way of my choosing. And it allows me to feel rather than numbing those emotions that I've always had. It allows a way for them to release and escape. So, as someone who has a lot of the same struggles, I definitely related with Lee's character a lot. And I find BDSM in my life to be a great source of mental health relief and of enjoyment. So for me personally, it's not something that I just do for my mental health, but I do find that it helps. So I encourage people to watch this film, not simply for the sexual explicitness, but for the deeper meaning. The deepness of Lee and Mr. Gray's relationship is quite astounding. Once again, this is not me encouraging everyone to jump feet first into BDSM. That would be irresponsible. But I think it's worth researching and see if this lifestyle is the right fit for you. Well, would you look at that? The time for our session has sadly come to an end. Make sure to come and join us next week. This was Mind Over Media. I'm Zoe, and as always, remember to protect your peace. You can find Mind Over Media podcast in the World 11 podcast feed at world11.podbean.com. All spelled out, all one word. World 11 Podcast Network can also be found on all major podcatchers, such as Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Good Pods. You can find the Mind Over Media podcast on Twitter at MindMediaPDcast, and the entire World 11 network at World1_1 podcast.